Welcome back. Today's story sounds unbelievable, almost impossible, yet it has echoed for decades through naval circles, declassified reports, and Cold War legends. The claim that a Russian submarine destroyed a U.S. aircraft carrier has been repeated in whispers, headlines, and dramatic retellings. But what really happened, and why did this moment send shockwaves through the world's most powerful navy? To understand this story, we must travel into the shadowy depths of the Cold War, where truth, secrecy, and psychological warfare often blurred together. During the height of the Cold War, the oceans became silent battlegrounds. The United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct war, but beneath the waves, their submarines hunted relentlessly. Aircraft carriers were the crown jewels of the U.S. Navy. They were symbols of dominance, floating airbases capable of projecting power anywhere on Earth. To the Soviets, these carriers were the ultimate targets. If a carrier could be neutralized, American naval superiority would be shaken to its core. The Soviet Navy invested heavily in submarine warfare for this very reason. Unlike the U.S., which focused on carrier strike groups, the Soviet strategy emphasized denying the enemy control of the seas. Their submarines were designed not just to spy, but to kill carriers. Massive nuclear-powered submarines armed with long-range cruise missiles were built with one mission in mind: find the carrier, track it silently, and destroy it before it could respond. One incident in particular became the foundation of the legend. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, U.S. carrier groups regularly conducted exercises in the Atlantic and Pacific. These exercises simulated real combat conditions. During one such operation, a U.S. carrier strike group believed it was operating securely, protected by destroyers, cruisers, and anti-submarine aircraft. What the Americans did not realize was that a Soviet submarine had already slipped through the defensive screen. According to later accounts from both sides, the Soviet submarine had been tracking the carrier group for days. Using patience, silence, and skill, it stayed hidden beneath thermal layers of water that distorted sonar signals. The submarine's captain waited for the perfect moment. In a real war, this would have been the point of attack. During the exercise, the Soviet submarine simulated firing a full salvo of anti-ship missiles at the carrier. These missiles, in a real scenario, would have been launched from hundreds of kilometers away, flying at high speed just above the ocean surface. The exercise results were devastating. The simulation showed that the carrier would have been hit multiple times before U.S. defenses could stop the attack. In war game terms, the carrier was destroyed. When the results were presented to U.S. naval commanders, shock spread through the fleet. An American aircraft carrier, the most heavily protected asset at sea, had been successfully killed by a single submarine. This was not a public announcement. It was classified, discussed behind closed doors, and deeply unsettling. Here is where the legend begins to grow. Over time, the phrase, destroyed, escaped its war game context. In reality, no U.S. aircraft carrier was physically sunk or destroyed by a Russian submarine. Not in peace, and not in war. But the simulated destruction was real enough to force the U.S. Navy to confront an uncomfortable truth: their carriers were not invincible. Then this happened. Instead of denying or hiding the implications, the U.S. Navy reacted with one of the largest doctrinal shifts in modern naval history. Anti-submarine warfare became an absolute priority. Carrier strike groups were reorganized. New tactics were developed. Escort ships received upgraded sonar systems. Submarine hunting helicopters became standard on nearly every surface combatant. Maritime patrol aircraft expanded their role, covering vast ocean areas in search of enemy subs. The U.S. Navy also invested heavily in quieter submarines of its own. If Soviet submarines could stalk carriers, American submarines needed to do the same, and better. This led to advances in nuclear propulsion, hull design, and acoustic stealth. The oceans became quieter, deadlier, and far more complex. From the Soviet perspective, the incident was a massive psychological victory. Without firing a single real missile, they had proven their concept. Soviet commanders believed that in a real war, coordinated submarine attacks could overwhelm carrier defenses. This belief shaped Soviet naval planning until the collapse of the USSR. Years later, after the Cold War ended, fragments of the truth began to emerge. Retired officers from both sides spoke more openly. Soviet submarine captains confirmed that tracking U.S. carriers was one of their primary missions. American officers admitted that there were moments when carriers were shadowed without detection. The legend was rooted in reality, but it had been exaggerated by time and secrecy. The most dramatic exaggeration was the idea that a U.S. aircraft carrier had actually been destroyed in combat. That never happened. No wreck lies at the bottom of the ocean bearing such a story. But the simulated destruction was, in some ways, more powerful. It exposed vulnerability without bloodshed. This realization changed how the world viewed naval power. Aircraft carriers were still dominant, but no longer untouchable. A single submarine, crewed by fewer than 100 sailors, could threaten a ship carrying thousands. It was a reminder that technology and tactics could level even the most unequal battlefield. The story also reveals the psychological dimension of the Cold War. Both sides wanted the other to believe in their strength. Rumors of unstoppable submarines and doomed carriers served that purpose. Fear was a weapon, just as much as missiles and torpedoes. Even today, echoes of this incident influence modern naval strategy. Nations investing in submarines often cite their ability to counter carriers. New technologies like hypersonic missiles and autonomous underwater vehicles are seen as the next evolution of the same threat. Meanwhile, carrier defenses continue to evolve, integrating satellites, drones, and advanced sensors to prevent another surprise. So what really happened when a Russian submarine destroyed a U.S. aircraft carrier? A silent duel beneath the waves. A simulated attack that exposed a dangerous weakness. And a reaction that reshaped naval warfare for generations. This story is not about a sinking ship, but about a wake-up call. It is about how close the world came to learning this lesson the hard way. And it is a reminder that in war, especially beneath the sea, the most powerful blows are often the ones that are never seen. If this had been a real war, history might have been very different. But because it was an exercise, because it was hidden in classified reports and quiet briefings, the lesson was learned without tragedy. That is why this moment still matters. Because sometimes, the most dangerous attack is the one that proves it could have happened at all.